All right. Thank you for joining us today with the American Values Coalition and our guests, Nancy Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead. We're going to talk today about the new conspiracism and assaults on democracy. So just think about, the most important political issues to you, whether it be inflation, immigration, poverty, abortion, whatever those are. All of those are dependent upon having a functioning democracy. So what we're talking about today is really foundational to whatever it is you care about and want to advocate for in your political life. Our authors today are Russell Muirhead. He's professor of democracy and politics at Dartmouth College. And he's also wrote The Promise of Party in a Polarized Age, which was published in 2014. And Nancy Rosenblum, she is professor of ethics and politics and government at Harvard University. And she's also wrote Good Neighbors, The Democracy of Everyday Life in America in 2016, and On the Side of the Angels, An Appreciation of Parties and Partisanship in 2010. She wrote some other books, but I mentioned those because they seem particularly foundational to the book that they co-authored. That's a lot of people are saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. So Nancy Rosenblum, Russell Muirhead, thanks for joining us. So the format is first they'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Nancy and Russ, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Nat. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us to join you this afternoon. We're really happy to be with you. And let me tell you a little bit about how we got into the subject and what we found once we did get into it. Conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists have always been part of American politics. The Declaration of Independence itself is a conspiracy theory. So you might even say the country is kind of founded on conspiracy. And yet, most of the time, conspiracy theorists are on the margins of American society and American politics. One really well-known book by a couple psychologists about conspiracy theories in America has a chapter titled "Conspiracy Theories Are for Losers." It's their title. But what they mean is that they're for people who are on the margins, who don't have a lot of status or standing, who aren't connected to the power elite, who see the workings of power at a great distance and who are mystified by the workings of power. And they invent conspiratorial conjectures in order to make sense of a world that they can't control. And what we came to see, what Nancy and I came to see, is that when we were looking at conspiracism in contemporary American politics, and this is about 4 or 5 years ago, before it really came to just wrap itself right around the whole of American politics, we saw some new stuff happening. For one thing, we didn't see theories. We didn't see conspiracy theories so much as we just saw free-floating conspiratorial allegations. And so that kind of classic conspiracy theory, whether it's somebody on the margins or whatever, they're trying to make sense of the world. They're looking at a world that doesn't make sense, and they're using a conspiracy theory to make sense of certain events, like, let's say, the JFK assassination. How does one lone gunman assassinate the most protected person on earth? That just on its face doesn't seem to make sense. Or even 9/11, why are we invading Iraq when we were attacked by people who were located in Afghanistan? And why were we attacked in the first place? These things don't make obvious sense. And so conspiracy theorists work up stories. The United States government was in on the planning of the attack on the 9/11 of the World Trade Center, the conspiracy theorist says. And that tends to make more sense of the event than just the event on its own. What we started to see was just conspiratorial allegations that don't make sense of anything. They don't start with an event. And they don't even mimic investigative journalism and try to come up with facts and evidence in the way classic conspiracy theorists really do. They just throw the allegation out there. So, Hillary Clinton running a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. I mean, there's the conspiracy. What does that make sense of? It's a really wacky narrative. And there's nothing out there. It's not like that some guy, Edgar Welsh, I think is his name, shows up at that very pizzeria armed with an assault rifle He believes the story, of course, and he goes in to liberate the children who are being held. He fires the weapon he's now in federal prison. There was no basement. There were no children. There was nothing there. There isn't a shred of evidence. There isn't a tiny little drop of a tiny little factoid that could support the story. It's just an allegation. So what this kind of thing is doing is not making sense of the world. It's really just repainting your political opponents as not mere opponents, but as truly evildoers. And that's something different. And I'll tell you, even, we chronicled it, we described it, we said there's something, we called it new. We learned, by the way, that if you call something new, every historian in the world takes it up as their quest to show you that it's not really new. But we thought we found something different, let's just say it, a little bit more unusual. Conspiracy without the theory, used for more partisan purposes than for the purpose of making sense of the world. And even after we described it, and as we were sending the book out to the publisher for the final draft, sending it into publication, we looked at each other and thought, well, what if we asked each other, what if this all goes away before the book comes out? We still thought we were describing something from the margins of politics. We thought it might just disappear. It might have just been an ephemeral thing, a comet fleeting across the sky we wrote a book about. And I remember we said to each other, well, if that's what happens, it'll be bad for our book, but it'll be good for our country. And all I can tell you, Matt, is that's not what happened. From that moment forward, it's like this has just metastasized, and things that were just little tiny developments like QAnon at the time we were finishing the book became huge, almost world historical forces. Does it sound, am I getting it right, Nancy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so then the question became for us, what is this conspiracy without the theory, without any dots or patterns or evidence and so on? What is it doing? What are its consequences for us personally and individually, and for American democracy? And I say personally and individually because the first thing that happens, and those of you who are listening to this may have experienced it yourselves, I expect you have, is this awful kind of disorientation. What's happening here? And I remember when it struck me very hard. It came right after Trump's inaugural, when the National Park Service publicized the photographs of the inaugural crowd. And Trump had said that he had the biggest inaugural crowd in history and that it was bigger than Obama's. And that's okay. People exaggerate. They want to, inflate themselves. But Trump's response was to say the photographs were doctored. That people in the National Park Service who are opposed to him have doctored the photographs. Well, this was completely disorienting. It was a sort of an assault on our common sense. It was a challenge to our sense of reality. There was no making use of it. And this continued then for 4 or 5 years under his presidency, and it has continued ever since. But the consequences are not just our own disorientation. And I have to say that this disorientation continues. I mean, I have not stopped being flabbergasted at the conspiracy claims that are out there, that Anthony Fauci today, right, is an enemy of the people. But it has real institutional consequences for democracy and behavioral consequences in politics. And I'll speak about one, and then I'll mention another. It's had 2 real consequences. One is that it has delegitimated political opposition, and in particular, the opposition party. American democracy is an electoral democracy, and you cannot have a party system in an electoral democracy unless you accept that the opposition is legitimate. It may be wrong, it may be corrupt in some ways, but it's still a legitimate opposition that you have to take account of, and you have to triumph over, if you can, through electoral means. Well, what we saw over the last few years is the delegitimation of the main political opposition, that is the Democratic Party. And the argument is that the Democrats pose an existential threat to the nation, whether it's to national security or to the secular or religious or civic or ethnic identity of the nation, that the opposition's goal is to deny America as a Christian nation, or to depreciate America as a white nation, or to empower takers and suckers, or to cede sovereignty to the New World Order. And this delegitimation of the opposition is the first and most important consequence, I think, political consequence of conspiracy without the theory. And I should just say, well, what do we mean by delegitimation? We don't use the phrase, and people use it all the time. And I think it means that the political opposition has no meaning, it has no value, and it has no authority. And the suggestion is that there's no need to comply with any of the things that the opposition, if it's in office, requires. So the first real institutional consequence is the delegitimation of the opposition and seeing it as an enemy of the state. And the second is, and this again you may appreciate and have seen for yourselves, is the delegitimation of what we call specialized knowledge. That is, that the branches of government and of the administration that have expertise and specialized knowledge in areas that are absolutely required for American public policy in any arena have been delegitimated. And it began, with the CIA or the FBI or with climate scientists, but it really extended to any element of the administration in which expertise thwarted what the leader wanted. So those are the three things: disorientation, delegitimation of political opposition, seeing the opposition as an enemy, and then delegitimation of specialized knowledge.
And I'll tell you that idea, delegitimation of your opponents, it's not always, it's not just like an intellectual idea. Oh, I think of my opponents as legitimate. It's a behavior, and the rubber hits the road when your opponents win an election and when your side loses an election. And if you've been holding power, you agree to turn over power to your opponents. And that turnover of power is what it means to see your opponents as legitimate. First time it ever happened in democratic history is 1800 in the United States, when John Adams turns over power to Thomas Jefferson. And when we were writing the book, we were aware of the rigged election conspiracy. It was an odd thing that Trump had argued that the election that elected him to the presidency was rigged. You don't usually see winners of the election saying the election was rigged, but he was saying that because he lost the popular vote. So we followed this rigged election conspiracy to its conclusion. And there we are in 2017, writing about the possibility of a president who refuses to turn over power after losing an election, claiming that the election was rigged. And when we were writing that, we thought we might be getting kind of hyperbolic again, that we might be going to an extreme. And we labeled that section worst case scenarios, because it was just sort of like following the logic out to the worst thing we could imagine, not really thinking this was going to happen. Certainly not thinking it was going to happen in 24 months. And then November, 2020, and Trump refuses to concede. And he tries to, cultivate a belief that the election was rigged, and succeeds at cultivating that belief in the minds of millions and millions of people. And then even attempts to he as we all know, directed his most ardent followers to attack the United States Capitol as the election results were being certified on January 6th, 2021. So that's what delegitimation means. It's January 6th. That's the culmination. It's not just a long word. It's something that really happens.
Russ, if I could just interject, my motto for what we've both been describing about having to accept the political opposition as legitimate is democracy depends on the losers. It depends on what the losers do. Okay, so you were going to talk about the logic of what happens from this accusation of a rigged election that, like the rest of these conspiracist claims, is a conspiracy without the theory.
And the logic, it leads to things like losers who refuse to concede. It leads to that, and that refusal then leads to violence. Refusing to concede isn't just a verbal act. It ends up, as we saw, becoming a violent act. And so, the conspiracism that we see in American politics today does take us to threat, intimidation, and violence. And that's the way it really, we called it the subtitle of the book, an assault on democracy. I mean, if that's how we're going to decide things together, through threat, intimidation, and violence, then we're not going to be able to make politics together. We're not going to have a democracy. And there's another, what we're working on right now is, in a way, following up on this other conspiracy that Trump used, the one that Nancy mentioned. He brought up right the day after his inauguration, when you think, by the way, you just get inaugurated president, you run for president, you win, you get inaugurated, you think you have one good weekend, before the trouble starts, before the crises and the problems and one good weekend, the inauguration weekend. But it was the morning after his inauguration that he was so bitter about the Park Service, and he says that they're arrayed against him, and that developed into the deep state conspiracy, that the United States government itself, the administrative state, the agencies and bureaus and departments of the executive branch, were conspiring to thwart the president, Donald Trump, and to defeat his followers, and really to betray the United States of America. And that deep state conspiracy also led to real action. It led to an attack on the state, on the post office, on the IRS, on the State Department, on on the personnel and the processes of the administrative state that do so much of the work of government, and without which I don't really think any government can function. So this is, also, this is something we're working on now, and it's another kind of example of the real damage that conspiracism does.
If I can say a word more, Knapp, about the sort of logic of violence that comes out of this kinds of conspiracism, which it says not only that the opposition is an enemy of the nation, but that this opposition is itself violent. And we saw it most recently when some people tried to say that the assault on the Capitol on January 6th was the work of Antifa or left-wing hit squads or whatever. That is, that the hated opposition is itself violent, not just rigging elections, but out there threatening you. And I think that what's most remarkable, and I'm sure we'll come to this, Knapp, when you enter the discussion and in the Q&A, is that threats and violence and intimidation have really become very widespread. We're not just talking about an unusual thing, like an extraordinary thing, like this assault on the Capitol on January 6th, but we're talking about intimidation and threats against Democrats, against kidnapping the governor, attacking people on school boards, attacking election workers and poll workers. And one of the interesting and really sort of tragic things is that what began at the upper levels of politics, right, has sort of infiltrated all the way down into the minutiae of public life, and even into relations amongst neighbors, as I'm sure some of your viewers will know, that between COVID and the rigged election thing, it has affected social and personal relations all the way down. And that's the sign, I think, of the real danger and destruction of a democracy, or of a liberal democracy, when things, even when they're awful, don't remain in the political public sphere, but infiltrate all the way down into social and personal life. Then we know that there's a damage being done.
Yeah, and that certainly relates to what we're doing here at American Values Coalition, which I'll talk about in a second. But first, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper with what you're arguing about political parties, because I think this is an area where people who are listening, or if they're watching on YouTube, the recording, may disagree with, or may have questions about, because there's so much this view in our society that the political parties are the problem, And it's easy to understand why someone would think that, especially when you see what's going on with the Republican Party recently, where the RNC censured Kissinger and Cheney. And so the easy sort of answer might be, oh, political parties are the problem. Let's limit their influence. But as you talk about, we've already been limiting the influence of political parties, weakening political parties for decades now. And this isn't just from the right. This is basically progressives and the Tea Party both hated political parties and wanted to limit their influence. And then Trump comes along and he is able, it's basically like a hostile takeover of a political party that had already become weak. It sort of opened that door. But what I think the important contribution you have here is to talk about political parties as institutions of democracy, right? Normally we think of, the three branches or whatever, but political parties themselves are important. Functioning political parties are important for a functioning democracy. So just talk a little bit more about that, about the importance of political parties.
You're on to us, Nat, because we are both, we're political theorists have been we're writing about parties before we got into writing about conspiracies, and we're unusual really among political theorists in the little domain of political science that we're in for our interest in parties and for the fact that we both appreciate parties. And look, I think the way to think about a political party is that it's a coalition. It's just a big group of people trying to be big enough to be a legitimate force in democracy. If you want to elect a member of Congress, you need to have a majority or a large plurality, depending on you need to be a large group. If you want to pass a bill in a legislature, you need to have a majority of that legislature at the very least. So any group that's trying to pass a bill, any group that's trying to elect a candidate and is trying to stand together over time to elect candidates and to stand for causes from election to election and from district to district, any group like that is a party, and you don't get to do democracy without it. Now, what the certain kind of populist says is, I don't want parties. I don't want anyone standing between me and the true people. Parties are people disagreeing with each other. Parties are different subgroups arguing and negotiating, and all of that distracts from what the true people want. I am the true people. I am the true, people's representative. I connect with them through my Twitter feed. I don't need a party standing between me and them. And what Nancy, I think, is that that's actually very destructive of democracy, to have one person claiming to be the whole people and to be the whole people's representative, and claiming that anyone who disagrees with them is betraying the people. What a party is a big coalition, is an entity that allows a lot of disagreement, allows a lot of discussion inside it. And so the Republican Party is a huge, great thing, one of the oldest democratic institutions in the entire world. And it's not just something that stands against the Democrats. It's a group that argues with each other. And one of the places where the outcome of that argument is temporarily kind of settled is the party platform. Every single presidential election since Abraham Lincoln gave definition to the Republican Party at its founding, every single presidential election, the Republican Party has hammered out a platform until the election of 2020. No platform. Trump would not let the Republican Party develop a platform. He would not let there be a party that stood for anything besides him and whatever he happened to say in the moment. That's what the party was. So you see, he didn't just take over the party. He tried to destroy the party. And it really should be an enduring, I think, embarrassment and mark of shame and cause of fear that this great party, this ancient democratic institution, gave up the project of hammering out a platform in 2020. So let's hope that comes back in 2024.
Let me say something more about parties, because I think your question is absolutely vital today. One thing I'll say is that America has a long tradition of being anti-party. Parties were seen as elites. Parties were seen as making political decisions about leadership in smoke-filled rooms. I mean, the progressives were the most important here, but there has been a strain of that all the way through. And what's interesting is that there's a strain not just against the parties themselves. I mean, what could replace the parties? Usually people had in mind direct democracy of some kind, right? Town meetings would govern, or initiatives and referenda. None of those can substitute for a major party in national politics that runs a government that has to do what it has to do. But in addition to anti-partyism, we've seen during my lifetime the rise of anti-partisanship. Well, if you have to have parties because otherwise democracy and government can't function, at least people don't have to be partisans. And over the last 20 years, may have noticed this yourselves, there's been a great sort of moral value put on independence, right? Independents are people who are not partisans, they're not loyal, blindly loyal to a party. They make decisions based on the moment or what they know. And one of the disadvantages of promoting independence, although we're certainly not opposed to it, we understand why people would want it, is that in order to have a functioning party that's the kind of coalition that Russ described, you have to have partisans who stand with it and do the work and who move with it over time. I want to make one sort of moral claim for parties in a democracy, besides all of these sort of instrumental ones, why we need parties to run government in a democracy. And the moral claim I'll make is exactly the claim against radical populists or against Trump. The moral claim is that there's a kind of moral discipline that partisans take on, which says that they recognize that they're only a part. They recognize that they live in a real pluralist society in which there's going to be lots of disagreement that makes sense. They realize that they're not always going to hold office or be in the majority, that elections are iterative, they'll come and go, that elections are not followed by suicide on the part of the people who are running, right? All of this is a sort of appreciation of the pluralism that really is American democracy. And I think that the people who embody this recognition of pluralism most directly, because it affects how they behave most directly, are partisans and people in politics who are party leaders. They have to accept that the other side is legitimate.
Yeah, and like I said in the intro, it's an interesting time to talk about the state of the Republican Party in particular, given the RNC meeting and the censure vote. But we also saw we've seen pushback from Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence, on this notion that the election was stolen. Could you just give me your quick analysis of the state of the Republican Party today? And the reason I ask that is that those of us sort of on the right side of American politics, kind of who aren't following Trump, we're in this constant debate of, do you let that party just sort of die on the vine and try to start something new, or do you stay in the party and try to reform it? This is just sort of a constant debate we're having. So what's your analysis of sort of the state of the Republican Party today?
Russ, you want to start or shall I?
Why don't you start, but I'm happy to jump in.
Okay, the state of the Republican Party today is dangerous. It's very dangerous. And it's speaking from the outside, because I'm a sort of moderate Democrat, I would say you have to stay with the party. That the experience in America, the history of America suggests that a new party, a third party, a fragment party cannot be successful. That you have to work as best you can from inside and have some confidence that the worst of Trump and the Trumpists will not be there forever, or even for the next couple of election cycles. It has been discouraging that Republican leadership has not stood up to him. And from outside, it looks as if an awful lot of that caving has been cynical. That is, it's only been about trying to preserve your electoral situation. So I was talking to Nat before we started about an article that the ex-Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank wrote in the Washington Post. Some of you may have seen it. And I thought it was a very interesting strategy. It was addressed to Democrats, and it was about Liz Cheney, who's going to be primaried from the right by Trumpists in her district in Wyoming. And Barney Frank said, Democrats should not run a Democratic candidate against her, that Liz Cheney should run as an independent or maybe as a write-in candidate, and the Democrats shouldn't run anyone against her. The Democrats should go out and vote for Liz Cheney, because our country is at a point where the particularities of partisanship matter less than having people who are friends of the Constitution, who will accept a fair election for what it is. That this is what binds Democrats and some Republicans, and the Democrats have to face, actually have to choose losing some elections in some areas in order to promote faithful Republicans.
And I think it is hard to, it's easy when you're on the other side. I'm also a Democrat. It's easy when you're on the other side to diagnose the flaws in the other side's party and in your opponents. It's really, it's an awkward thing to try to really recommend how that party should repair those flaws when you're not really in it. But it would be, I would have to say, I think it would be a mistake to, at this point, abandon that party, the party of, just in very recent history, McCain, of Romney, of really, really good, noble people who led it until just, a little while ago. And I really think that, I think the health of American democracy, I don't want to say the fate of it, but possibly the fate of it too, really depends more on the Republican Party and whether it can select leaders who believe in governing. And so I would hate to see every force within the party abandon the party, every force, that believes in governing, believes in constitutional government, abandon the party. The Democratic Party has its own internal challenges, and if you're a Democrat, I think you have your own kind of fight to fight. But just I don't think you're going to realize much success by trying to start a new party from the outside. And there seems to be still a lot to work with in the Republican Party, not including the great public philosophy of conservatism. And
Right.
I think Trump betrayed that.
Yeah, well, this goes back to your earlier point about the Republicans under Trump not even presenting an agenda. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell, as some of you may remember, echoed that when he was asked, well, is there a Republican agenda? And he says, well, that's a question for another time. Well, it's not a question for another time. And what Republicans have to do, enough of them have to do, it seems to me, as a minimum, speaking from the outside, is show that they really want to be a governing party, a conservative governing party, and not just the party of obstruction.
I think there are really interesting questions about, I think, if I were going to treat Trump sympathetically, I'd say he really introduced new policy options. I hate to talk this way about Trump because he's opposed to policy. Policy is something that constrained his will, but he brought up, he had a view on trade that really broke the bipartisan consensus about NAFTA and WTO. And it'd be interesting to see the Republican Party really hammer out a view about trade. Under Trump, it kind of had Bernie Sanders trade policy. It'd be interesting to see the Republican Party really hammer out a view on America and the world. Trump brought Howard Dean's foreign policy to the Republican Party. And right now, with the Ukraine and Russia, it's not clear what the Republican Party's principled posture is toward America in the world. And I don't think America first is the way to go, but that needs to be. And immigration is another one where we from the beginning of Obama's first term, Obama said we need comprehensive immigration reform and bipartisan immigration reform, a real policy that the country can live with for 20 or 30 years. So it would be, I think, good to actually, there's a lot of important policy work to be done, and there's a Republican contribution to that work that I think would benefit the country. And I would encourage you to stay in it.
So one of the things we're doing here at American Values Coalition is we're building this community of people who have been affected by what you call it the new conspiracism, because like you talked about in your remarks, this is really disrupted relationships. It's broken relationships. It's torn families apart. It's tearing communities apart, and church communities. Whatever it is that that people you find themselves in their friendships and their family unable to have just regular conversations because of this. So many people being misled by this misinformation crisis. So let's talk a little bit about, what just individuals can do about this. What we often get that some version of that question, what do I do about my crazy uncle kind of question, right? The people who are like so in this alternate reality, how do you help bring them out of that? So talk a little bit about that. And also if you could talk about the backfire effect and define that for us.
So the backfire effect is one where people who are in the grips of misinformation are presented with corrective, real information, and in the face of that correction, double down on their conviction about misinformation. So somebody believes that the election here in New Hampshire in 2020 was fraudulent. And Joe Biden, by the way, won the state of New Hampshire. Somebody believes that Donald Trump really won the state of New Hampshire. Someone is presented with information, say by the Secretary of State in New Hampshire, actually then in the face of that information somehow converts that into even more reason to believe that the election was fraudulent. So that's the backfire effect. By the way, there's not as much evidence for the backfire effect. If that were true, would really doom us. I mean, it means that like no amount of fact checking can work, and that fact checking actually has the opposite effect of what it's trying to have, which is reduce people's certainty about things that don't have a really great factual basis. Let's put it that way. Instead of reducing people's certainty, they increase their certainty about things that don't have a factual basis. If that were true, like how would we possibly discuss things with each other? How could we possibly ever correct any, erroneous views that we ourselves have? So that would be a really, really bad. And it turns out that the first initial research on that showed some findings that really haven't been able to be replicated, and that it's really not as large an effect as people initially feared it might be. And there's some good evidence to show that fact checking does work. That people, when they're confronted with good information that corrects certain views, will at least reduce the certainty that they held those erroneous views. And so we don't live in that world of a backfire effect, although you can get it maybe in certain rare circumstances. Information does work. Good information does help. But listen, it's never easy to change someone's mind. I mean, it's super hard to change anybody's mind about anything. It's super hard to have your own mind changed. There are lots of reasons why it's hard to change someone's mind. And a lot of them have to do with pride. But let's just face it, none of us change our minds all that often. And we sure as heck don't change our minds when some know-it-all is sitting right next to us, arguing with us. That's just not a good, it's not a good dynamic for hanging out. And it's not a really good way of changing someone's mind. I think if you're really friends with somebody who believes something you think is really, really wrong, there are lots of conversational avenues you can take. But, just hammering them with why you think they're wrong is probably not going to result in a mind change. What do you think, Nancy?
Well, I think that there are some people who are invulnerable to being argued with. And that's because the views that they have, whether it's about the election rigged or about COVID being perpetrated by enemies of the nation, they've been energized by this. It's become part of their identity. It's a fellowship that they have with other people. And so asking them to change that conviction is asking them to give up a lot, right? It's not asking them simply to change their mind. It's asking them to alter their social experience. I will say that in the case of COVID, it has become weirdly politicized. Everybody sees that. I mean, why in the world should this pandemic have begun to track very deep political divisions? It's the oddest experience. Someday somebody is going to write this history and try to explain how this happened. I was in a group the other day talking about how you deal with people in your family and friends who are anti-vaxxers. And it was a very dispiriting conversation because people didn't know how to do it because for the reasons I described in others, convictions couldn't be changed, but most of all because in the case of COVID, it's not just a matter of, it's a matter of how you physically deal with people in your family. Do you go to dinner with them if you have young children and they haven't been vaccinated? And the same is true as interests me, friends and neighbors. That COVID is in some way the sort of deep, not institutional politics, all the way down story of conspiracism and what happens when it gets energized and how it affects our lives really intimately, not just politically.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the anti-vax compared to the stolen election narrative is that Donald Trump has been actually saying that the vaccine is safe. So that makes it very different than the stolen election thing, and he still doesn't seem to have much effect on it.
And it's also, I think, the vaccines. I mean, some people are belatedly coming around to this, but they reflect his own commitment to government-funded science. Operation Warp Speed was not something that people put a lot of stock in June 2020. I think there are a lot of experts who said we're not going to be able to develop vaccines inside of a year or so. And within 6 months, there were multiple very, very good vaccines produced by the West, by Germany and the UK and the US, and largely funded by the United States government. And this should be, I think something that we should celebrate. Nobody in the world wants the Sino vaccine. Nobody wants the Russian vaccine. They want the vaccines that were funded by the Trump administration and by the United States of America and by Western science.
But don't forget the other side of what Trump did, and this is what makes him very hard to understand. I mean, he proposed cures that were dangerous to people, the hydrochloroquine and the more
bleach,
right, and bleach. He publicly sidelined and humiliated his own chosen COVID advisors like Deborah Birx. This was an example of the delegitimation of specialized knowledge that I spoke of. And he hasn't claimed credit, which he could very well have, for the development of the vaccine. So, it's hard to know whether he's the initiator or how much he is responding to this base that he helped create, but that nonetheless is no longer under his control. And I think that's the point where he's living now, and so are we.
I mean, one of the things I would just say too, Nancy, about interacting on an everyday level with somebody, let's just say, who's in the grips of a conspiratorial, theory like the stolen election conspiracy. If you have a genuine friend, someone you would be hanging out with who believes the election was stolen and you don't, how do you manage that relationship? Can you manage a relationship across that kind of epistemic divide? And I think, one of the things Nancy and I got really worried about when we were writing the book was how to preserve the possibility for disagreement. When we are rival partisans, if you're a conservative and I'm a liberal, we can have lots of interesting discussions. I mean, that's the beginning of a certain kind of political friendship across the aisle, if we have the stomach for it. There's a lot to talk about. But conspiracism creates a kind of epistemic divide where we no longer share a world that we access through common sense. And without that shared world that's accessible through common sense, it's really hard to be in conversation. It's really hard to sustain a friendship. And so I guess, if I were going to counsel somebody on what to do, if they had a friend who was on the other side of this epistemic divide, I'd say somehow try to get access to the world that you know through your common sense. And it may be that you have to talk about things outside of politics and outside of the election in order to just recover that shared that access to a shared world.
All right. Let's get to some of the questions here. The first one's very long, but so I'm not going to read it, but it's basically about racism, I think, seems to be the question. And its influence on conspiracy. I would add to that, we just saw recently in the Virginia governor's race how critical race theory was used to great effect. And there was a lot of misinformation regarding what critical race theory actually is and its influence in K through 12 education. So any thoughts on racism and conspiracies?
I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll just offer this. We have been negligent if we haven't made the point here that some conspiracies are true. Some conspiracies really are real. They're out there, and so to reveal them and to try to expose them and unravel them are true. And I think that there are some situations in which you can say that racism really has produced, in particular cases, not just generically in this country, has been pursued in a conspiratorial manner, and that it has had very destructive effects. I think that the sterilization of Blacks is an obvious example, which was covered up. And when you say there was a conspiracy to assault Black sexuality and reproductive capacities, it's true. So it's hard sometimes to distinguish these conspiratorial claims with regard to race from sort of more general sort of sociological examinations of what's going on. But we shouldn't dismiss the fact that there can be conspiratorial claims on both sides.
And I think what's really, I think what's sort of unique about what the work Nancy and I have done on conspiratorial thinking in American politics is that we're in many ways really sympathetic to conspiracy theory for the reason that Nancy just mentioned. Sometimes a conspiracy theory is true. Sometimes the government behaves with treachery and covers it up. And there is a conspiracy, and it's exposed because of a conspiracy theory, a hypothesis that turns out to be true. And so we actually think, we think a lot of conspiracy theories are really zany and unsupportable. But some are true, and conspiracy theory, like the Declaration of Independence, can be very empowering. What we're more concerned about is this kind of conspiracism, conspiracy without the theory, the conspiracy, the free-floating conspiratorial charge that just simply tries to obliterate access to common sense and remake the political world so that your opponents are enemies.
Yeah, I wonder if those acknowledgments might be important as far as reaching people who are, believe in some of these conspiracy theories. I think, for instance, of there's good reasons to not trust drug companies, right? We just saw the opioid epidemic, and they lied to us, so why trust them? And so it's not that. So with the vaccine, it's not that you're trusting the drug company to tell us the truth. You're trusting the evidence of it actually working in the society and people who take it and so forth. So,
So let's talk a little bit about skepticism, because I think there's a big difference. It's really important to be skeptical of authority, skeptical of expertise, skeptical of elites, maybe even skeptical of government. Skepticism and conspiracism are not the same thing. Is that right, Nancy?
Absolutely right. We should be wary. We should be on our guard all the time of people who want to take advantage of the American people or some section of the American people in one way or another. Knapp, what I was thinking of as you were speaking just now was the many year conspiracy by the tobacco company to keep under wraps the consequences of tobacco. So there are powerful forces, self-interested forces that work against the public good, and many of them are corporate, outside of politics, but there's some in office and in politics as well. And I completely endorse skepticism. But it's hard to be skeptical alone, right? I mean, most of what we know, we take on faith, right? What do I know about tobacco or fossil fuels? And so it matters what community of knowledge we take on faith, right? And I think that what's important is that we take on faith the answers that come from communities of knowledge that are themselves, that function themselves in a skeptical way. It's not just that we be skeptical. So science, for the most part, lots of mistakes, so on and so forth. But professional scientists are rarely just self-serving. It happens, of course, but they're rarely just self-serving. And there's something about the way in which science works that is internally skeptical, right? You have to prove things to your colleagues. You have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. You get opposition all the time. You may be forced to change your ideas. There's some reason to put our faith in a community of vaccine experts. So it's not just that we have to be personally skeptical, we have to know who to put confidence in. And one measure of who to put confidence is somebody who's part of a group that is itself open-minded.
And there's just a posture in, to believing stuff about politics. I think in politics, it's really hard to be 100% certain. There's very, very little, the things that you're 100% certain about don't tend to be of huge political importance. Like I'm 100% certain about what my phone number is. I know it, but it doesn't help me much when I think about what to do. When it comes to political things, it's really hard to get to 100% certainty. You're pretty good if you can get to 75 or 80. And so I think what skepticism does is it moves people off that 100, position of complete certainty. It relaxes our fanaticism and our sense of certainty, but it doesn't prevent us from believing things. And so we still, you can say, I believe, I'm pretty certain. Given what I've been able to, what I know, given what people say, this is what I think is right. That's the way you function in the political world. The conspiracists aren't in that world of saying, I'm pretty sure. I believe, given what I've been able to read or given what given what I've seen. They're 100% certain. They've got the whole truth. And so in a weird way, it's them. They're the ones who are obliterating skepticism and replacing it with a kind of fanatical certainty.
It seems to me there's a healthy skepticism and an unhealthy one. And so right now you have like this conservative media bubble. Now, of course, there's a liberal bubble as well. But on the conservative side, you have news organizations. Let's just take, the biggest one, Fox News, who's saying, you can only trust us to give you the correct information, right? So you have to come to us. We'll give you the correct information. You can't trust anybody else. And so an unhealthy skepticism, which we see all the time, on the conservative side is just, if it comes from the New York Times, it must be false. A healthy skepticism would say, okay, the New York Times sometimes, doesn't get everything right, especially first day story, when they're reacting to what's happening in real time. So a healthy skepticism would say, okay, but let's see what's the evidence that they're providing in this news article to for what they're saying, and so that you're going in skeptical, but you're not just going to discount it right away just because it's the New York Times, right? So I think the challenge for conservative communities is to reaffirm the skepticism, but say, you need to be, have a healthy skepticism about it.
Nat, yeah. The only thing I disagree with in what you just said is to describe that media as a conservative media. There's nothing conservative about it. It is radical and extremist in the radical extremist extreme. And so I think that characterization is wrong. Find another word.
But I do think, Nancy, that the challenge to maintaining a sort of skeptical posture exists on both sides. It's also probably not just a conservative phenomenon.
Right.
I have some close friends who watch MSNBC 24/7.
Right.
They can develop a real certainty about things too that would be relaxed a little bit if they treated it a little more skeptically.
If I can give an example of that, it's true. I think quite highly of Rachel Maddow, but I have to say that for several years she pursued the Trump as a conspiracist and his connections to Russia, day in and day out, 365 days of it, so on and so forth, on and on. We still don't know what exactly the connections were to Russia, but it's just to say that there is conspiracism on both sides. Although I will say, for Rachel Maddow and the sort of lefty conspiracists, that they were looking for evidence. They were looking for evidence, but the conspiracist impulse is not on one side only.
How concerned are y'all about the future of our democracy right now?
You know, I in an earlier answer, I toggled between saying something about the health of American democracy depends on how the Republican Party defines itself, and saying the fate of American democracy depends on how the Republican Party defines itself. And I'm somewhere between those 2 points. I want to be sanguine and say, you know, look, this is a very, very stable constitutional democracy. There are very, very many, you know, sources of solidity, and you know, we shouldn't be overly alarmed. And so it's really, we're just talking about the health of democracy. At the same time, I think you know what we've learned in the last, you know, 5 to 10 years is that democracy is much more fragile than we really came to believe in that kind of triumphal moment following World War II, in the decades following World War II. And it just doesn't take long to undo. And you can have a several, you know, 200+ year history of constitutional democracy that's radically weakened in merely a decade. And so I'm somewhere between saying the health of democracy, you know, depends on how we figure this stuff out, and saying the fate of it depends on how we figure it out.
I do think it lies in citizens' hands and not just in the hands of high officials or elites, so it's the Supreme Court or anything else. And I think that what I recommend to everyone, and I do think that this may seem strange to say, but I think that in some ways the fate of democracy in America is going to lie in local and state politics and not at the federal level. And that for anybody who truly cares about this, go be a poll worker and go run for your school board in your locality, go to your community meetings, because these are being overrun and they can be taken back in a way that it's much harder to take back the National Republican Party. So.
All right. Nancy Rosenblum, Russell Muirhead, thanks for joining us. Pick up the book. A lot of people are saying. Thank you.
This was fun.
Thank you.